introduce our final paper for this session. Delighted, very pleased to be introducing Jason Ur and Nader Babakr, who will be talking to us on landscape and settlement on the Erbil plain, Kurdistan region of Iraq. Jason, over to you.
Thank you, Roger, for that introduction, and congratulations on an extremely well-run session. We are precisely on time. How often does that happen? All right. I'm hoping you're seeing, there we go. Okay. Good afternoon to friends and colleagues in the Middle East and in Europe. It's 9:30 here in just outside of Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Boston. So good morning to colleagues here in the Western Hemisphere in North America. I'm speaking today on behalf of myself and Nader Babakr, the Director of Antiquities for the Erbil Governorate, and we're going to be presenting our results from the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey on the Dashti Hawler plain of in central Kurdistan region of Iraq. Now, our project is designed to recover archaeological sites from all time periods, from the Neolithic to the present, to map them and to record them. But we have a particular research question that we've primarily been focusing on in the first phase of our project. And that is the question of, was the landscape of the Assyrian core planned? Previous research that I've done on the early Bronze Age landscapes has suggested to me that despite the signs of early complexity and political centralization, the landscapes of these early Bronze Age cities was largely emergent from the actions of individuals and was not planned in a top-down manner. But the Assyrian case really struck me as potentially being different. And there are four reasons for this hypothesis. The first is there are good signs of planned urbanism, the great capitals of the Assyrian Empire being the best examples. Here you see the wall around Nineveh. Fascinating new research by Niccolo Marchetti and his team coming out of this site. The second is good evidence for hydraulic engineering in the form of canals and even aqueducts. And this has been known for quite some time, but is really emerging really strongly with the new work of Daniele Morandi and his team in Lonap. Third is evidence for demographic engineering. We see this in the form of evenly scattered villages, largely on the fringes of the Assyrian core. This is work that was established by Tony Wilkinson and also Daniele Morandi in areas in the Jazeera. And finally, there's good evidence for ideological engineering in the form of landscapes of ideology, in the form of rock-cut monuments that really show the divine justification for rule by the Assyrian kings. And again, new and fascinating research in this end in the Feda area, again led by Daniela, you see on the lower right. So bringing these elements together, it strongly suggests a very top-down planning to the Assyrian landscape. But mostly what I've showed you thus far has been, until very recently, extremely anecdotal. So in order to test this hypothesis, my team and I have begun a survey, well, starting in 2012, a survey in the Assyrian imperial core in the area that is today part of the Kurdistan region of Iraq. This is the Erbil Plain Archaeological Survey, the boundaries that you see here in white. This is comprising a large chunk of the so-called Assyrian Triangle, the very core of the empire. And this is the first time that we've had a really high intensity landscape view of this space. Before getting into what we found, I do want to talk about methods. Now, this is a challenge. We're attempting to bring the intensive methods pioneered by Tony Wilkinson into an area on the scale of the surveys of Robert McCormick Adams in the 60s and 70s. This presents a particular challenge. So I want to describe how we're attempting to meld these two approaches. First, let me show you the project region. This is the plain of Erbil, the Dashti Haler in Kurdish. We have a contract with the Kurdistan regional government for 3,200 square kilometers surrounding the modern and ancient city of Erbil. This is an area that is not completely unknown. In the 1900s, there were some excavations at places like Kalinj Aga, Kasr Shamamuk. And since 2010, there have been extensive excavations in this area. But our questions about Assyrian planning require more than just these excavated places. We really need to look at the rural landscape. And towards that end, we began with declassified intelligence imagery from the Corona program, especially. And using this imagery, we have identified 1,956 potential places for archaeological investigation. You see them here in black, and you can see this is an incredibly dense settlement landscape. Now, this is a landscape project and not just settlement patterns. So we've also identified almost 350 kilometers of pre-modern open canals. And we can add to that over 350 kilometers of pre-modern tracks or hollow ways. And the final element is over 12,000 shafts, which comprise several hundred kares or kanat systems. So you can see this is an extremely full archaeological landscape, not just sites, but also landscape features. It's a big challenge to document all of this. Now, since 2012, we have surveyed about 1,140 square kilometers. That's about 35% of our contracted area. And we've confirmed 721 of these places as archaeological sites. As I showed before, a lot of our work is based on historical aerial and satellite imagery, especially from declassified American intelligence programs, especially the Corona program, which ran through 1972. But increasingly, we're relying on the successor program called Hexagon, which ran from 71 up to 1984. And we've also recently discovered the declassified film from the U2 aerial program, which covered the Middle East between the years of 1958 and 1960, so very early scenes. These different imagery sources give us different views into the landscape. For example, the Corona imagery has proven to be very sensitive to soil, anthropogenic soils, whereas the U2 program imagery was taken early in the morning, so it's very sensitive to topography. We can see shadows very clearly on the U2 imagery. The hexagon imagery has proven to be very useful for the built environment, especially villages of the 1900s. We find that modern satellite imagery isn't terribly useful, although it can see beyond the panchromatic. However, we find that the modern landscape is so degraded that largely we use modern imagery for navigation. It tells us where the roads are so we can get to the sites that we need to investigate. Our data sets now, they used to live exclusively on my computer, but in an attempt to provide better access to our full team, we've moved all of our data into the cloud. So all of our data sets, sites, collection areas, it all lives on the ArcGIS Online cloud hosting platform, which means that it can be created and edited in a web browser, on a desktop application, but also on mobile devices. And this has been truly revolutionary because every team member has a smartphone in their pockets. So through ArcGIS Explorer and ArcGIS Collector, we all have the ability to view and create data on the fly in the field, and very often in real time, especially when we're close to Erbil, which has very good cellular data coverage in the area. we're moving this forward in an attempt to be as transparent as possible with our colleagues in the Director of Antiquities by moving this into dashboard formats that allow them real-time access to our findings in very easy to use formats. So this is, at present, this is purely for the use, this will be purely for the use of colleagues in the Director of Antiquities to serve their mission of conservation and protection. But it is in real time, so there is literally no data that the project has that the Directorate of Antiquities does not have access to. So there's only so much you can do from space in the air. We visit these sites and we collect them according to the methods that were largely developed by Tony Wilkinson in his long and tremendously productive career, involving collecting surface artifacts from discrete areas of sites. We also map the sites, which is now being done almost exclusively via UAV or drone mapping procedures. Our workhorse since 2016 has been a DJI Phantom 4 quadcopter. Since 2017, this device has been operated almost exclusively by my colleague Khalil Barzinji of the Directorate of Antiquities in Erbil. And in 2018, we acquired a fixed-wing SenseFly EB Plus, here modeled by the fabulous Petra Creamer, University of Pennsylvania. This is the device that we use for large-scale landscape mapping and for our largest sites, because it can stay airborne for about 50 minutes and has an extremely precise onboard GPS. So we don't just collect pretty pictures, we collect data. This is probably technology that's familiar to a lot of you at this point. Our drones fly transects across sites with overlapping photographs that can then be brought into photogrammetric software and turned into ortho photos and terrain data. So on your left, you're seeing the SRTM data that we had to rely on prior to bringing drones into our protocols. On the right, you'll see an the same site and the same view, but at a 5-meter spatial resolution DEM, which is so good that you can not only see our two dig vehicles, our two survey vehicles, you can also see the furrows in the fields surrounding this small mound. Truly revolutionary, this new drone technology. So let's move on to our results. So we have had 7 field seasons between 2012 and 2020. We took the years 2014 and 2015 off because the Kurdistan region had bigger problems with Daesh than archaeology. But you will notice that we had a 2020 field season. I'll speak about that in a moment. But our Kurdish colleagues undertook a brief but productive 2020 field season in our absence. Let me start with some overall results. The pattern that we see in the settlement history on the Erbil Plain is not terribly unfamiliar. It looks remarkably similar to the patterns that have been documented in the Jazeera by Wilkinson, by my own survey around Tel Hamukar, and increasingly with the other surveys in the area of the Kurdistan region. Small numbers of prehistoric sites, and starting with the mid to end of the 4th millennium, a real tremendous expansion in numbers of sites and site areas, which reached a peak in the Neo-Assyrian period, although interestingly, we're finding now a second peak under the Parthians. Now, in my talk today, I want to especially highlight the Uruk period of the mid to late 4th millennium BC. I'm then going to speak a little bit about the Middle Bronze Age, or Old Babylonian period in the Southern chronology. And then finally, the focus of our Phase 1 research project, the Iron Age, or the Neo-Assyrian period. These results will be given in detail in a forthcoming report that will appear in the journal Iraq. We're hoping this will appear online in the coming month or so. So let me start with the 4th millennium, the time of the so-called Uruk expansion. Our results really complicate this. Now, we would have hypothesized at the beginning that we were part of the expansion area, the periphery. But our results are challenging this. In fact, they've led me to suppose that if periphery and core even has any meaning anymore, the Erbil plain is part of the core of the auric world. So the dominant paradigm here is that of Guillermo Algaze, who proposed that initially the auric expansion moved into Susiana very early, before expanding up the Tigris into the Jazeera especially, and moving over into the Tigris region, and a third phase moving up the Euphrates to the famous sites of Habuba Kabira and Jebel Aruda, and perhaps simultaneously up into the Zagros. I've indicated the Erbil plain region here. You'll notice that this Piedmont area is largely exterior to Algaze's model, primarily out of simple ignorance of the archaeology, and not on the part of Algaze, but on the part of all of us, because this region has been understudied. But if we're really going to look at this, we need to take a comparative perspective, and let's start by looking at the south, the so-called heartland of cities. Adam's Nippur survey and his Warka survey recovered 357 sites over 7,286 square kilometers, and that comes to a ratio of about 0.05 sites per square kilometer. So this is some baseline data for the nature of settlement in the core of the auric world. But let's turn to the Erbil plain. So we have recovered 43 sites over this particularly well-surveyed area of 740 square kilometers. This ratio comes to 0.06 sites per square kilometer. So that's actually slightly more dense than in the southern core. Now, there's some justifiable reasons for this that probably relate to methodologies. Adams was working by himself, and he didn't have access to a lot of the technology and the remote sensing sources that we do. But nonetheless, it's pretty striking. I want to emphasize that these are auric sites. These are not local northern late Chalcolithic sites. These are archaeological sites that all have the complete component of auric ceramics, and not just bell rim bowls, but also that grit tempered types that you all know. This is an auric landscape. Let's put it into perspective, comparing it to the North Jazeera and Hamukar surveys, which also had relatively high densities of auric sites. But these surveys are surrounded by other surveys that showed little or no evidence of southern Mesopotamian archaeological sites, including Beidar, Leilan, and further to the east, Algaze's Jizre survey, and then the recent surveys of Flonap and Ugzar. And I could put the Ihas survey in there as well. There's a difference here, though. The Hamukar and North Jazeera surveys, almost all of the sites, if they had auric on them, they also had a high component of local late Chalcolithic ceramics. This is not true on the Erbil plain. The auric assemblage dominates. In fact, it's probably higher than this, because I suspect that some of the LC types that you see here are gray wares that actually belong more closely related to LC2. So I imagine that auric percentage should actually be even higher. So I will somewhat provocatively propose that the auric world actually might look something like this. What we see as an alluvial phenomenon might actually be more of a Tigris-Piedmont phenomenon. This is obviously something that's going to require a lot more work. It would be great if we could look at the Kirkuk plain, for example, but something to think about as we move forward. Let me turn to the Middle Bronze Age now. This is a time when northern Mesopotamia was in some small kingdoms that were ultimately consolidated under the King Shamshi Adad into this so-called northern Mesopotamian kingdom. The Erbil plain factors into this because it has been supposed to be the kingdom of Kabra. So our project was very interested to see if we could locate this known political capital. We think we found it in site number 31, today called Kurd-Kabrstan, which features on corona imagery a very distinctive white discolored area, but also a a very distinctive circular kind of oval area around it that we hypothesized was going to turn out to be the city wall. And indeed, when we went to the ground there, we did find some very faint topographic traces. If you follow this blue line, you can kind of see it there in this drone shot, but it's much more clear looking at the terrain data produced by our EB device. Now, this site has been under excavation by a team from Johns Hopkins, directed by Glenn Schwartz, and has been subjected to geophysics by Andrew Creekmore, which is very satisfying because Andy's geophysics found lovely traces of the city wall, complete with bastions at 20-meter intervals along its northern face. We're more confident than ever that what we're seeing is the famous city of Kabra, shown with its city wall on this monument of Dadusha. In terms of its region, this area has a pattern that I want to focus on, so that when we look at the Assyrian pattern next, we'll have something to compare it to. Now, Kurd Kabristan is very large, at approximately 100 hectares, maybe larger. But surrounding it is a small Bronze Age landscape of relatively small tells, very evenly spaced, and adhering very closely to water sources. This is not atypical for Bronze Age throughout the northern Mesopotamia, but as we'll see, radically different from the pattern that succeeds it in the Assyrian period. So you'll remember that we were looking for planned urbanism. We were looking at planned hydraulic landscapes. We were looking at demographic planning. That's what we're testing to find, and we found all of that in our results thus far. The urbanism was not a big surprise. The site of Qasr Shamamak, ancient Kilazu, has been well known for quite some time, and especially now through the French excavations that have been ongoing since 2011. But Qasr Shamamak is an exception. Overwhelmingly, the Neo-Assyrian sites that we find are very small, on the order of 1 or 2 hectares, such as these low mounds that you see right here. When we look at them at a regional scale, we find that they are extremely abundant. And unlike the pattern that we saw in the Middle Bronze Age, they're fairly disconnected from water. At least they're very disconnected from the modern water courses that we see, far more so than any other period that we've analyzed. This may be because the climate was different, or this may be because water was being brought to these places by canals that we've not yet been able to, some that we've not yet been able to identify. But overwhelmingly, these are small sites, very similar in scale to what we saw in the North Jazeera, Tel Beidar, and Hamukar area, and also at a similarly high density. In fact, even higher density than we saw around the North Jazeera and Hamukar area in terms of sites per square kilometer. So we're seeing demographic, I think we're seeing both the demographic engineering as well as the urban engineering parts of our hypothesis. And I want to turn to hydraulic engineering now. We have found evidence for some massive hydraulic interventions in the landscape. The very large feature you see stretching right here between across a watershed is what we call the Zaga Canal near the village of Zaga. Shown in a corona image and here in a hexagon image. We flew this a couple of years ago with the EB, and using about 2,000 vertical photographs produced this DEM. There is a scale bar on this, but it is very difficult to convey the scale of this feature through a map. So hopefully this will run. This is a short drone video giving you a sense of the monumentality of this feature. It's 100 meters wide and very often about 10 meters deep. On the left, you see our survey vehicle, and I believe that is Khalil standing there piloting the drone. This is truly a massive feature and comparable in scale in the Bandwai Canal that is found above Nineveh. We don't have good direct dating evidence, but based on morphology, it radically differs from the Sasanian Islamic canals that we know and looks remarkably similar to that Bandwai Canal. We also reinvestigated the area around the Bastora Canal, identified by Fuad Safar in the 1940s. Safar identified the canal head, which had an inscription on it that named Sennacherib as the commissioner, and described how water was brought through this canal underground to the city of Erbil. Now, we were largely interested in getting terrain data for this area, and that's why we flew it with the drone. But our work discovered in the orthophoto a particularly interesting feature in the upper right that had been recently uncovered under the floodplain silts that seems to be the base of a dam. Now, one edge of it has been badly damaged, but the upper edge, if you trace that, assuming that it continues under the silts, leads directly to that canal head. So there's a bit of difference opinion amongst the team about what's going on here, but I have proposed that this is a weir that would have directed water flowing down the Bastora into this canal and taking it to Erbil. So this was not a very durable landscape. In fact, we find the work of Rocco Palermo has revealed that after the Assyrian period, settlement numbers and area declined pretty dramatically. By the time we have a good picture again in the Hellenistic era, we see far fewer sites and generally on a similarly rural, but without any of the urbanism that we saw in the Assyrian period. This is going to appear in a forthcoming article led by Rocco that will detail this in detail. And indeed, Rocco has a web map that I'm hoping he'll share in the chat right now if you want to investigate this further. So it looks like I'm running out of time. So let me skip ahead a little bit. All right. I want to end by acknowledging the fantastic team that's behind all of this. I want to especially single out Dr. Rocco Palermo and Dr. Petra Creamer, the two associate directors of the project. And I also want to single out the Kurdish component of this team, led by Nader Babakr, my co-director. In the 2020 pandemic circumstances, it was not possible for foreigners to travel to the Kurdistan region, but because our Kurdish colleagues have become so adept at this work and are fully trained in all of our field techniques and our digital technologies, they were able to undertake a short season in which they covered 80 additional square kilometers of our survey region. So I'm hoping that this will be a model for collaborative work moving forward. Finally, I want to thank the Kurdistan Regional Government and the State Board of Antiquities for the permission to undertake this work, especially Kefi Ali in Erbil. I want to thank Harvard Groningen for funding, as well as the National Science Foundation, National Geographic, and Dumbarton Oaks, and colleagues at the U.S. National Archives that helped us with all this imagery. Finally, thank you all for listening.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Jason. We have a couple of minutes for questions and discussion. I see in the chat, Rocco Palermo has mentioned, in case you want to know more about corona and site identification in EPAS, check this ArcGIS online story map with a link to follow and a comment that you should make sure to zoom in to compare historical imagery and satellite base map. Rafał Kaliński, thank you. As always, your presentation is impressive and enlightening. I'd like to remark the Ugsar area registered several LC 3 to 5 sites, few of which have exclusively southern assemblage, all apart from one located east of the Great Azab. The one on the western bank is located opposite a contemporary settlement on the eastern bank. Okay, thanks for that. Rocco again with another link to transition between Assyria and the Seleucids. And Daniela Morandi Bonacosi, congrats, fascinating as always. Do you think in your Uruk pottery assemblage you have also early Uruk material, as Regis Valley has in Logadan and Girdikala?
Well, the easy answer is I don't know. What we don't have are a lot of the drooped spouts that I associate with late Uruk. The problem that we have is there really is no good stratigraphic sequence through the Uruk ceramics. The Nippur sequence is kind of published, is barely published. The Uruk sequence from the deep sounding at Uruk is also problematic because it wasn't fully collected. So I don't have confidence in any southern sequences. I don't know Regis's sequence yet well enough, but especially if it's tied to radiocarbon dates, it's something that we really should apply to get a sense of the timing of these settlement transitions on the Erbil plain.
Thank you. We do need to have a break because I know the technicians need a break as well. So there are further comments. So maybe, Jason, I could encourage you to read those comments in the public chat on eBrida and reply to them individually. So for now, thanks very much for those papers. A really interesting session and lots of great discussion. And we now have a break for 30 minutes, and I'll be back to chair the next session of Field Reports in half an hour. So may hopefully see some of you there or elsewhere during the rest of the Congress. Thank you very much and goodbye for now.